When you need the user to make a selection amongst several options, the check button and radio button are excellent widgets to use. Check buttons are a slightly more advanced version of the basic button. In addition to executing a callback function when clicked, they can also store a binary value. This makes check buttons ideal for when the user needs to select or unselect options from a series of choices. Radio buttons are similar to check buttons because they also maintain a value. However, unlike a check button, they're not limited to only two choices. Radio buttons allow a user to make one selection from a series of mutually exclusive options. They're ideal for when you only have a handful of choices for a user. For example, selecting your meal choice for a banquet. I've already imported the tk-enter package, as well as the themed tk module, and created my top-level root window using the tk constructor method. So let's jump straight into creating a check button. I'm going to use the ttk module and call the check button constructor method. The first parameter, as always, is the parent, in this case, the top-level window. And for now, I'm just going to set the text property to say spam. And to display the check button on the window, I'll need to use a geometry manager. So I'm going to use the pack method. And now we've got a spam button over here. I can click anywhere on this check button and it'll toggle whether or not that button is selected. Now, check buttons have many of the same features that the basic button widget has. You can use the command property to configure a callback to be executed when the check button is clicked, and that callback functions the same way as we saw with a regular button. You can use the state method to enable or disable the check button, and you can use the end-state method to check on the current state of the button. You can use the invoke command to programmatically execute the callback associated with the check button, and you can configure the check buttons to display both images and text. We've already covered all of those methods and properties in the previous video on the button widget, so I'm not going to cover them here. They function the exact same way for the check button and radio button as they did for the button widget. As I mentioned before, what makes check buttons and radio buttons unique is that they can also store a value. Before we get to that, we first need to discuss variables. TK programs written using Tcl allow the system to let you know when a certain variable has changed so that any widget referencing it can be updated. Python doesn't have a similar method for tracking changes to a variable, so the tk-enter module has included several classes for variable types, which are wrappers to provide that change tracking functionality. The four variable classes that are available in tk-enter are boolean var, double var, int var, and string var. To create a string variable for our program, I'm going to call the string var constructor method, and I'm going to save it to a variable called spam. To set the value of this variable, we can use the set method on spam, and since it's a string type variable, we'll pass in a string. In this case, I'll make it say spam with an exclamation point. And if we want to check what the current value of a variable is, we can use the get method. And this will return the string that's stored within that spam variable. So now that we have a string variable, let's configure our check button to be associated with it. Use checkbutton.config. I'm going to set the variable property to be the name of that variable, spam. And by default, the check button uses a value of 1 when selected and 0 when not selected, and it'll assign that to the variable spam. But that doesn't make sense with the meaning of spam, so we can actually specify an on value and off value that'll be assigned to the variable depending on whether the check button is selected or not selected. So if the check button is selected, we'll want to set the value of spam to say spam please, and if the check button is not selected, we'll say boo spam. Now it's configured that way. Let's test it out. If I select the check button and I look at the value of my spam variable by using the get method, you see that it says spam please. And if I uncheck that check button and I look at the value of the spam method or spam variable, it'll say boo spam. So those are the basics of the check button. Now let's look at radio buttons. As I mentioned before, radio buttons store the selected value from one of several mutually exclusive options. So let's make a radio button to select what we want to have for breakfast. I'm going to make a variable called breakfast and create a string var to assign to it. Now to create a radio button, I'm going to use the ttk module, call the radio button constructor method, pass in the parent, which will be root, set the text for that radio button. So this one will be called spam. Configure the variable that's associated with that radio button. So this variable will be breakfast. And then we also need to specify a value which will be assigned to that variable if this radio button is selected. So I'm going to make the value here be spam. And I'm going to go ahead and just directly call the pack method on this call to the constructor method. The constructor method call here will return the object, and then the pack method will be called directly on that object. And so when I do that, you can see it automatically creates a radio button, the difference being it's round instead of square, to my window. I'm going to copy this line and create several more similar radio buttons. So I'm going to create one for eggs. We'll create one for sausage. Give ourselves a couple different breakfast options. And finally, I'm going to add one more of spam. And now you notice the radio buttons are not aligned here, but we'll learn how to fix that later in the geometry management videos. Each radio button is its own object, and they're all tied together by that common variable. So you notice if I select spam, since two of the radio buttons are associated with the spam value, by selecting one, they're both selected. But if I select eggs, only one has that eggs value, and similarly, only one has the sausage value. Just like with check buttons, I can use the get method on that variable to get the value. So we've currently selected sausage. If I select spam, and call the get method, we'll see that we want spam for breakfast. And that pretty much sums up the basics of using the check buttons and radio buttons. Since I introduced variables in this section, there is one last trick I want to show you. For widgets that have a text property, such as labels, buttons, check buttons, and so on, there's also a text variable property that you can use. Assigning the text variable property to a string var will allow you to update the text of a label or button by just changing the value of that variable. For example here, I'm going to modify the check button object to use the text variable property instead of assigning it static text. So I do check button.config, and I'll say text variable equal breakfast. And so now the value of my check button is going to represent whatever the value of my breakfast variable is. So as I choose different items for breakfast, that check button will change its text. Don't worry about the strange behavior for this layout for now. We'll learn how to deal with that later in the geometry management section of the course.